Chapter 55, The Backstory, Part 1, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu had never been so nervous in his life. Not when he was called before the high priest, not when he met Antony, not when he waited for his god to return from the battle. Nothing he had ever felt could compare to the fear singing through his veins now. Antony had opened his closet and pulled several things out of his chest, the chest that had caused so much trouble what seemed like a lifetime ago. His face was no longer flat and distant, as it had been that morning, nor was it wounded, as it had been yesterday when Hanyu spat those fateful words at him. Instead, he looked grim and determined, and that scared Hanyu worse than either of the other expressions had done. His god didn't want to get rid of him. Hanyu was almost sure of that. His voice had been too raw and sincere when he said that he would miss Hanyu if he were gone. But he seemed to have it in his head that Hanyu would be better off without him, and that kept Hanyu on edge. How was a person supposed to talk a god out of doing something that he intended as a kindness? Antony sat cross-legged at the foot of the bed, facing Hanyu where he perched uneasily at the head. Hanyu had sat like this with Sao 100 times on their temple cots, gossiping and telling secrets. Was this the universal pose for exchanging confidences? I suppose the best place to start is with ourselves, Antony said, shaking him from his thoughts. My friends and I were elves, not gods. He watched Hanyu solemnly, as if he were expecting some sort of reaction, but Hanyu was careful to swallow his giggle. Oh? Antony blinked. Oh? That's all you have to say? Well, Hanyu shrugged. It's just a little silly. Of course you're gods. I've seen how strong and fast you are. You don't get any older and you eat blood. Whether you're called gods or elves, you're certainly not humans. No, we're not. But that doesn't make us gods. We didn't used to be like this. So you became gods? No! Antony shook his head. We were cursed. All right, cursed to be gods. Antony was beginning to look frustrated. No! We were born like anyone else, and we can't see into anybody's minds or fly, or make new lands or people or anything like that. Hanyu shrugged, unperturbed. I never said you did. Why would I expect that? You've never said you could. Those aren't things I would expect a god to do. Gods didn't age. Gods recovered from what should have been mortal injuries. Gods were stronger and faster than any human could dream of being. Gods had dark skin and pointed ears and fangs. Everybody knew it, and Hanyu didn't understand where Antony was getting all these other ideas for powers he felt he ought to have. Antony looked as if he wanted to argue more, but instead he sighed. Fine, it doesn't matter. You just need to realize that we were different when we were born. Our people lived longer than humans, 200 years sometimes, but we got older and died. We could go in the sun and eat ordinary food. Ah, that had been quite different indeed, then. Hanyu felt his chest filling with excited questions, but he kept them down. This was clearly not a time for interruptions. Antony continued. There were humans there, too, but they weren't, well, they were serfs. That's something like a cross between a slave and a farmer. The few humans who weren't bound to a particular lord's land worked as laborers or servants, and they weren't paid very well. Unless they worked for my mother, that is. Antony turned to his pile and retrieved something. It was the portrait of the woman that Hanyu had found before. Looking at her face next to Antony's, the resemblance was striking. They had the same startlingly dark skin and pale, expressive brows. She wore elegant clothes and had jewels in her ears and at her throat, but there was still an indefinable simplicity in the way she held herself. Her face, as she smiled at the artist, at Antony, was so warm and affectionate that Hanyu felt tears spring to his eyes. He had liked her as soon as he saw the painting, but now he liked her even more. He liked anybody who would look at Antony so tenderly. That was my mother, the god. Hanyu hadn't found his arguments to the contrary very convincing, said, pointing. Her name was Cassia. She was a concubine of King Octavius, my father. Do you have a picture of him? Hanyu asked. Maybe Antony's father had provided the long nose and thin lips that Hanyu longed to pepper with kisses. Maybe, being a king, he'd also provided Antony's propensity to glower. Cassia was smiling, and, given the lines of her face, it seemed to be her habitual expression. As if in answer to Hanyu's thoughts, Antony scowled. It was such a dear, familiar expression after all his solemnity that Hanyu couldn't help breathing a soft sigh of relief. No, his master said. I didn't care to make a portrait of the king, But my mother was wonderful. She had come from a poor family, and she tried to make sure Claudia, Titus, and I realized how lucky we were never to be without. She was a very gentle person who loved music and flowers and animals, so the two of you would have gotten along. There was something so easy and intimate about the assertion that Hanyu was a little startled. The idea that Antony had drawn a connection in his mind, however simple, between his clearly adored mother and his foolish slave was somehow staggering. Antony was still speaking, oblivious to Hanyu's churning thoughts. She was honest and sincere, which was not a very good trait for a member of the court, so she mostly stayed in her own little house and courtyard within the harem, where the consort and the other concubines wouldn't have to see her all the time. And, I suppose, where they wouldn't see us. You, Lord Claudia, and Lord Titus? Yes. The god nodded, his face growing grim. The consort and her children were always afraid that one of us would try to seize the throne. It had happened before, that a bastard would raise enough support to unseat the true-born heirs. And they were right to worry, because even though our mother tried her best to persuade all of us to stay well clear of politics, Claudia and I were scheming and building a faction at court by the time we were 15. Hanyu couldn't keep himself from blurting out the question. You were going to take the crown? Not at first, his master replied. We just wanted to have enough friends and supporters that we could protect ourselves and our mother from the consort and her children when the king died. Antony stopped and laughed. His laughter had been so hard and bitter as he told the story, and this laugh was no exception. He curled his fingers into a fist and tapped it lightly on his knee. Hanyu didn't know why, but he felt that Antony wanted to strike himself harder, but was restraining himself because of his offering's presence. Well, that's what Claudia and Titus wanted, the god said. I was more ambitious, by which I mean that I was stupid. I hoped to spearhead some social reforms. I was quite the dreamer at the time. I wanted more money for schools, more ships built for exploration, equal rights for humans. The first two reforms sounded exactly like what Hanyu would expect of his kind-hearted map-collecting master, but the third gave him pause. Antony had wanted to make humans equal to the gods? The idea was mad, but then, as he'd said, perhaps they had not quite been gods yet. Surely no one would propose something so ridiculous now. Antony went on. I hardly remember what I wanted. Nothing that endeared me to my father, certainly. He had never been a particularly warm parent, but it infuriated him when I would bring proposals or appeals for one of my pet projects before the court. I didn't care. I thought that as long as he was alive, he'd protect me, no matter how far I pushed propriety. After all, he was my fucking father. There was a strange note of appeal in that last sentence, and Hanyu wasn't sure how to respond. He'd never known his father, and wasn't sure what could reasonably be expected from one. Yes, there had been priests he particularly liked, especially Father Shu, but he never assumed that they would offer him any special protection. That had always come from his friends, especially Asao. And these days, from Antony. What did Hanyu know about fathers? Luckily, Antony continued before he had to come up with a response. Even though we weren't angling for the throne, we proved to be surprisingly popular, especially among the younger members of the nobility. The more support we gained, the more the consort and the crown prince took notice. Not long after Titus came of age, they started to pay very close attention to us. Claudia and Titus realized what was happening and tried to warn me to be careful, but I'd become distracted. Antony turned again and retrieved another portrait. This was the one of the human man with plain clothes in the garden, and the god looked down at it with a raw tenderness that made Hanyu's chest ache. Valerius, Antony said, pronouncing the man's name softly and worshipfully. He was one of my mother's servants, her gardener. We met when I came to visit her during his first week of work, and he tripped and spilled fertilizer on my feet. He was so embarrassed. His nostrils would flare when he was feeling shy, and it made him look angry. We used to stand around stammering like fools. Well, he got more and more nervous, and I worked myself into a panic because I thought I was infuriating him. The god's voice was so soft and fond that Hanyu, childishly, wanted to beg him to stop at this part, while the story was still happy. Antony shook himself. We became friends, and then we fell in love. It wasn't technically illegal for elves and humans to be together. Lords were known to abuse their serfs fairly regularly, and there were relationships and even children between humans and lower-class elves. But it was an extreme taboo, so we kept it a secret from everyone but Mother for almost 4 years. Your mother didn't mind? She was thrilled, actually. Antony gazed down to the bedspread where he'd set her portrait. Mother never was one to worry about social status. She adored Valerius, and she was so happy to see our joy. Hanyu stared at his master and tried to imagine him love-struck and youthful. Not that he looked old now, but his small frame was so full of years and sorrows that even his unlined face sometimes seemed incredibly ancient. What must he have been like when he was with Valerius in the garden, in the sun? Antony's face turned so soft when he spoke of his long-ago lover that for just a moment Hanyu thought he could imagine it. He pictured his god, sun-drenched and beaming, holding the gardener's dirty hand and laughing at the man's protests that he would ruin his fine clothes. He pictured them kissing through smiles and curling up in the grass, their legs tangling together like roots. It was a beautiful thought, far too beautiful to ruin with jealousy. Hanyu only wished that the story of Antony and Valerius could have had a happy ending, that the love on Antony's face didn't have to be paired with the anguish in his voice. He also wished he hadn't spoken so cruelly and flippantly about Valerius's death. Gods, what was the matter with him? Antony was still speaking, and Hanyu reluctantly shook off his thoughts to hear the next dreaded part. It might have gone on like that, but I got sloppy about my intrigues while I was distracted by him, and finally it was clear that the consort suspected us of aiming for the throne. At that point, it was all over. No matter how many supporters we drummed up, my brother and sister and I wouldn't outlive our father by more than a year. The god laughed, low and bitter. Hanyu wished he could hug him, but he stayed on his side of the bed for fear that the slightest movement would bring the story to an end. As much as he didn't want to hear the tale's finale, he didn't think he could live with the curiosity. Ironically enough, that was what sealed it, Antony said. Our only hope was for one of us to make a bid for the throne. I thought it would be Claudia for sure. She's the smartest of us, always planning and maneuvering a few steps ahead. But she wanted it to be me, and most of our supporters agreed. Hanyu burst out without meaning to. Of course they did! You're wonderful! Antony flinched. His slender fingers knotted together, and Hanyu was sure that the gesture was meant to conceal trembling. The consort didn't think so, he muttered. Somehow, she found out about me and Valerius. She sent some of her goons to kidnap him and torture him for information about me. I think she planned to drag him before the court to tell everyone about our affair and our faction's plans to take the crown. She held him for 2 whole days before I managed to find the place. Antony's voice dropped to a growl, but this growl bore no resemblance to his usual harmless, crabby tones. Hanyu had to fight not to shrink back from the remembered rage on his master's face. That was the first time I ever killed people, Antony said. I thought later that they were only following orders and I ought to feel guilty about it, but I never did. I was just glad that I was able to get him out. My rescue mission almost killed me, but he was in even worse shape. Once we were back safe with my mother and our bodies had recovered, he forgave me. I still can't quite believe that. All he'd been through because of me while I wasted my time on useless searches, and he still forgave me. The god's eyes were distant as he went on. He was so much better than I deserved, and I knew I could never let anything like that happen to him again. I realized I couldn't bear to lose him. And lucky us, I thought I knew how to keep him safe. I thought I was so fucking clever. Antony gave a ragged sigh and stared down into his hands, his face twisted in a way that made Hanyu forget his earlier fear in a sudden rush of longing to cross the bed and take him in his arms. He gripped the sheets and restrained the urge, forcing himself to wait quietly for the god to speak. When it came, Antony's voice was barely even a whisper. We got married. Married?